The afternoon sun poured through the large glass windows of the Grand Oak Bank, casting long shadows on the pristine marble floors. It was a busy Friday, and the hum of transactions, keyboard clicks, and murmured conversations filled the air. Customers stood in line, some checking their phones, others shifting impatiently. Behind the counter, the tellers moved efficiently, processing withdrawals and deposits, their faces wearing the polite but detached expressions of routine work. At a desk near the center of the bank, Daniel Carter, the branch manager, adjusted his tie and glanced at the clock. He was a man of habit, a firm believer in order and structure. With nearly 15 years in banking, he had built a reputation for being strict but efficient. To him, everything and everyone had a place, and when something didn't look right, his instincts kicked in. That's when he saw him. A tall black man in a sharp navy blue suit had just walked in. He had an air of quiet confidence, the kind that turned heads without effort. His movements were unhurried, purposeful. He held a small leather portfolio in one hand and checked his phone briefly before heading toward the telecounter. But something about him made Daniel uneasy. Maybe it was the way he scanned the room, his eyes taking in the surroundings with a calm intensity. Or maybe it was just that Daniel had never seen him before. Daniel straightened in his chair, watching as the man stepped up to the counter. The young teller, Mia, greeted him with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you today?" The man returned the smile, his voice deep but warm. "I need to make a withdrawal from my business account." He slid an ID and a withdrawal slip across the counter. Mia glanced at the ID, her expression neutral. She nodded and began typing into her computer. But as she worked, Daniel's unease grew. He didn't recognize this man, and Grand Oak Bank wasn't the kind of place where strangers with large business accounts just showed up out of nowhere. He stood up from his chair, making his way toward the counter. "Everything okay here, Mia?" Daniel asked, his voice even but firm. Mia hesitated. "Yes, Mr. Carter. Just processing a withdrawal." Daniel's eyes flickered to the ID on the counter. He picked it up, studying the name, Marcus Bennett. It wasn't familiar. He glanced back at the man, his mind racing. "Mr. Bennett, you said this is your business account." Marcus nodded, his expression remaining calm. "That's right." Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly. "And what kind of business do you own?" There was a pause, brief but noticeable. Not because Marcus was unsure, but because he recognized the tone in Daniel's voice. It was the same tone he had heard too many times before. A tone laced with quiet suspicion. "I own several properties and invest in local businesses," Marcus replied evenly. "This bank happens to be one of them." Daniel let out a small, disbelieving chuckle. "You're saying you own part of this bank?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." For a moment, silence stretched between them. A few customers nearby had begun to notice the conversation. Mia glanced nervously between her manager and Marcus, sensing the sudden tension. Daniel's mind worked quickly. He had been trained to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him. A man he didn't recognize, claiming to be an owner, requesting a large withdrawal. Something didn't add up. "Excuse me for a moment," Daniel said, forcing a tight smile before turning away. His heart pounded as he walked briskly toward his office. Once inside, he closed the door and pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for only a second before dialing. 911, what's your emergency?" A dispatcher's voice came through. "This is Daniel Carter, branch manager at Grand Oak Bank. I have a man here trying to make a suspicious withdrawal. He's claiming to be a business owner, but something isn't right. I think we might have a case of fraud or identity theft." The dispatcher's voice remained calm and professional. "Can you describe the individual?" "Black male, mid-40s, well-dressed, but his story doesn't add up," Daniel said, his voice lowering instinctively. "I need officers here as soon as possible." "Understood, sir. Officers are on their way." Daniel hung up, exhaling sharply. He had done his duty. If this man was legitimate, he'd have no problem clearing things up with the police. But if he wasn't, well, Daniel had just prevented a major financial crime. Back in the lobby, Marcus remained at the counter, his patience thinning as he noticed the hushed murmurs and the way Mia now avoided eye contact. He had been in enough rooms like this to know when the atmosphere had shifted. He glanced toward Daniel's office and exhaled slowly. Then he heard it, the distant wail of sirens approaching. Mia's hands froze on the keyboard. A few customers turned toward the front entrance as red and blue lights flashed against the glass doors. Marcus clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on his portfolio. He had a sinking feeling he knew exactly what was about to happen. The sharp sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the steady hum of the bank. Marcus remained still, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter. He had felt this before. The shift in the air, the way people suddenly moved differently around him. It wasn't new, but it never got easier. Mia, the young teller, swallowed hard and darted a glance at Daniel, who stood near his office, arms crossed, watching the entrance like a man waiting for confirmation that he was right. The other customers in the bank had started whispering, some inching away from Marcus as if he had already been convicted of something. A second later, the glass doors swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Their presence commanded immediate attention, and the quiet murmurs in the room faded. The lead officer, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, scanned the room before spotting Daniel. He approached with measured steps, his partner a few steps behind. "You called about a possible fraudulent transaction?" the officer asked. Daniel straightened his tie and nodded, motioning toward Marcus. "Yes, officer. This man, Mr. Bennett, claims to own a business account here, but something about his story doesn't check out. He says he owns part of this bank, but I've never seen him before." The officer nodded slowly, then turned to Marcus. His eyes studied him, as if trying to size him up in a matter of seconds. "Sir, can we step over here and have a word?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Marcus took a slow breath, reminding himself to stay composed. He had been in business long enough to know that power didn't always come from raising your voice, it came from controlling it. "Of course," he said evenly. He picked up his portfolio and followed the officers to a quieter section near the waiting area. The officer pulled out a notepad. "Mind telling me what you're doing here today?" Marcus glanced at Daniel, then back at the officer. "I'm here to withdraw money from my business account, just like I told the teller. I showed my ID and the necessary documents." "And what business do you own?" Marcus exhaled through his nose. "Real estate, property investment. And like I said, this bank is one of the institutions I've invested in." The officer gave him a careful look. "Do you have any documentation to support that?" Marcus didn't break eye contact as he unzipped his portfolio, pulling out a few sheets of paper. He handed them over, watching as the officer flipped through them. There it was, official paperwork, legal filings, signatures that proved his partial ownership in Grand Oak Bank. The officer's expression remained neutral as he scanned the documents. But before he could say anything, Daniel stepped closer, his voice laced with skepticism. "Officer, paperwork can be faked. Anyone can print something off the internet." Marcus let out a slow, controlled breath. "Are you seriously suggesting I forged legal documents just to withdraw money from my own account?" Daniel didn't answer immediately, but his silence spoke louder than any words. The officer's partner, a younger officer with a softer demeanor, leaned over to glance at the documents. He frowned slightly, then whispered something to his superior. The lead officer gave a small nod and turned back to Marcus. "Do you have a way to verify your account with a business representative?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, you can call the bank's corporate office. They'll confirm everything." The lead officer considered for a moment, then turned to Daniel. "Mr. Carter, do you have access to corporate records?" You should be able to verify this internally instead of assuming wrongdoing. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I'll check. He walked briskly toward his office, clearly irritated. Marcus sat down in one of the chairs nearby, resting his hands on his knees. The younger officer shifted awkwardly beside him, as if sensing the tension in the air. You live around here? The officer asked after a pause. Marcus glanced at him. I grew up in this city, moved away for college, built my businesses elsewhere. But I decided it was time to reinvest in the community that raised me. The officer nodded slowly, but before he could respond, Daniel returned, his face stiff. He stopped a few feet away, looking as though he had swallowed something sour. Corporate confirmed it, Daniel admitted, his voice tight. Mr. Bennett does have ownership in this bank. A silence stretched across the room. The officers exchanged a glance before the lead officer turned back to Marcus. Apologies for the misunderstanding, sir. You're free to continue your transaction. Marcus nodded but didn't immediately move. He studied Daniel for a moment, watching the way the man avoided eye contact, the way his hands flexed slightly at his sides. Marcus had seen this reaction before, the realization of a mistake, the unwillingness to fully acknowledge it. He stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. You were quick to call the police, he said evenly, his voice calm but weighted. Without asking any real questions. Without verifying anything first. Daniel's face darkened. I was following protocol. When something seems off, I have to act. Marcus held his gaze. And what exactly seemed off? Daniel didn't answer. The silence in the bank felt heavier than before. A few customers who had been pretending not to listen now shifted uncomfortably. Mia, still behind the counter, looked down, avoiding the scene entirely. Marcus exhaled slowly, then turned back to the officers. Thank you for handling this professionally. The lead officer gave a small nod. Just doing our job, sir. Marcus turned back to the counter, his patience running thin. Mia, let's finish this transaction. She swallowed hard and quickly processed the withdrawal. When she handed him the cash, her fingers trembled slightly. I'm really sorry about all this, sir, she said softly. Marcus offered a small, tired smile. Not your fault. He took his money, tucked it into his portfolio, and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he glanced back at Daniel. You might want to rethink your instincts, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Because they almost cost this bank a lawsuit. Daniel's face burned, but he said nothing. Marcus walked out, pushing open the glass doors and stepping into the warm afternoon air. He had come here for something simple, a withdrawal, a routine visit. But instead, he had been reminded of an old lesson. No amount of money, no level of success, could shield him from moments like this. As he walked to his car, he could still feel the weight of eyes on him. But he didn't look back. Inside the bank, Daniel stood motionless, his fists clenched at his sides. The realization was sinking in, not just of his mistake, but of what it revealed about him. Outside the bank, the afternoon air felt heavier than before. Marcus stood next to his car, gripping the door handle, his mind replaying the last 20 minutes. He had come in for a simple transaction and left feeling like he had just stepped out of a courtroom. He wasn't new to situations like this. He had faced the subtle glances, the questioning stares, the need to prove himself over and over again. But this time it stung differently. Maybe because he had a stake in this bank. Maybe because no matter how much success he achieved, it still wasn't enough to be seen without suspicion. He took a breath, releasing his grip on the door. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Just as he pulled out his phone, a voice called from behind. Mr. Bennett. He turned to see Mia, the young teller, stepping out of the bank's glass doors. She hesitated before walking closer. I just wanted to say again that I'm really sorry about what happened, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That wasn't right. Marcus studied her for a moment. She looked nervous, maybe even embarrassed. He could tell she was young, still early in her career, but something in her face told him she understood exactly what had happened back there. "You don't have to apologize for him," Marcus said. Mia shook her head. "It's not just about him. It's the way things are. I've worked here for almost 2 years, and I've seen things, little things, comments, decisions. Stuff that makes you question if it's really about security or if it's something else." Marcus sighed, slipping his phone into his pocket. "You ever spoken up about it?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "To who?" "Mr. Carter. The same man who just assumed you were a fraud." "It wouldn't change anything." Marcus nodded slowly. He had been there before, back when he first started in business. There was always that moment where you had to decide. Keep your head down or push back. Mia hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. She handed it to him. "This is the number for someone at corporate," she said. "A regional manager. I don't know if it'll help, but maybe they should know what's happening in their branches." Marcus took the paper, unfolding it briefly before slipping it into his pocket. "Thanks, Mia." She nodded and turned back toward the bank. Marcus watched her disappear through the doors, then exhaled and got into his car. As he drove through the city, his hands remained tight on the wheel. He thought about all the employees working under people like Daniel, the ones who noticed but said nothing, the ones who felt powerless. Then he thought about Daniel himself. The way his expression had shifted when he realized he was wrong. Marcus had seen men like him before, men who never questioned their own judgment until they were forced to. He knew this wasn't over. Back inside the bank, Daniel sat in his office, staring at his computer screen but not really seeing it. His mind was still stuck on what had happened. He told himself he had just been doing his job, following protocol, protecting the bank. But that excuse felt thinner now. His assistant, Carla, knocked lightly before stepping in. "Everything okay?" Daniel glanced at her, then back at his screen. "Yeah. Just a busy day." Carla hesitated. She had known Daniel for years, had worked under him long enough to read his moods. She shut the door behind her before speaking again. "You messed up today." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I followed security procedures." Carla raised an eyebrow. "Did you? Or did you just assume the worst because of who he was?" Daniel opened his mouth to argue but stopped. The words felt stuck. Carla sighed, crossing her arms. "You should call corporate before he does. Because if this turns into something bigger, you might not have a desk to sit at next week." Daniel swallowed hard, a slow realization creeping in. He had made a mistake, one that could cost him more than just his pride. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus sat in his office, looking at the small piece of paper Mia had given him. He reached for his phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a voice answered. "This is Jennifer Collins, Regional Manager for Grand Oak Bank. How can I help you?" Marcus took a breath. "Miss Collins, my name is Marcus Bennett. I believe we need to have a conversation about one of your branch managers." And just like that, the wheels were set in motion. There was a brief silence on the line before Jennifer Collins spoke again. Her voice was even, professional, but there was a hint of curiosity beneath it. "Mr. Bennett, I appreciate you reaching out. What exactly happened?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring out the window of his office. The city lights flickered outside, but his mind was still back in that bank, still hearing Daniel's dismissive tone, still feeling the weight of every glance that had been cast his way. "I walked into one of your branches today to withdraw money from my business account," he said, keeping his tone measured. "Despite presenting all the necessary documents, I was met with immediate suspicion. Your branch manager, Daniel Carter, assumed I was committing fraud and called the police on me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus could almost hear Jennifer processing his words, realizing the weight of what he had just said. "The police," she repeated. "Yes," Marcus said. "They showed up, asked for verification, and once everything checked out, Mr. Carter had no choice but to admit his mistake. But the damage was already done. Jennifer exhaled softly. Mr. Bennett, I can assure you this is not how we expect our employees to treat customers, especially someone with an ownership stake in our institution. Marcus could hear the controlled frustration in her voice, but he wasn't looking for corporate apologies. I don't need an apology, he said. I need action. Because if this happened to me, I can only imagine how many others have been treated the same way and walked out without a way to defend themselves. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. You're right, she said finally. This isn't something we can ignore. I need to investigate this further. If you're open to it, I'd like to set up a formal conversation between you, myself, and Daniel Carter. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The last thing he wanted was another conversation with Daniel. But something in him knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or assumed guilty without reason. Fine, he said. Set it up. That night, Daniel sat at his dining table, staring at his phone. He knew a call from corporate was coming. It was only a matter of time. His stomach twisted at the thought of what Marcus might have said, of how this might escalate beyond his control. His wife, Lisa, placed a plate in front of him, watching him closely. You've been quiet since you got home, she said. Something happened at work. Daniel hesitated before rubbing his face with both hands. Yeah, something happened. Lisa sat down across from him, waiting. They had been married long enough for her to know when he was wrestling with something. He let out a slow breath. I made a bad call today. A customer came in, someone important, but I didn't know it at the time. I didn't believe he was who he said he was, and I called the police on him. Lisa's expression shifted, concern flickering in her eyes. What do you mean you didn't believe him? Daniel looked away, his throat tightening. I just had a bad feeling. Something felt off. But I was wrong. He was exactly who he said he was. Lisa was quiet for a moment before leaning forward. Daniel, was it because he was black? The question hit like a punch to the gut. He wanted to say no, wanted to deny it immediately. But the truth sat heavy in his chest. I don't know, he admitted, his voice quieter now. Maybe. I didn't think I was that kind of person, but I saw him and I assumed the worst. Lisa sighed, shaking her head. That's a problem, Daniel. You know that, right? He nodded, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, he said. I know. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the bank's corporate office. His posture straight, his expression unreadable. Jennifer Collins met him in the lobby, offering a firm handshake. Thank you for coming in, she said. Marcus nodded. Let's get this over with. She led him to a conference room where Daniel was already seated, his fingers laced together on the table. He looked up when Marcus entered, his expression difficult to read. Jennifer took a seat at the head of the table. Gentlemen, she began, we're here today to address what happened yesterday. Mr. Bennett, I want to give you the opportunity to speak first. Marcus folded his arms. I think everything that needs to be said is already clear. I walked into a bank that I partially own, and I was treated like a criminal before anyone bothered to verify anything. Jennifer turned to Daniel. Mr. Carter. Daniel cleared his throat. I made a mistake, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I misjudged the situation. I thought I was doing my job, but I realize now that I was letting my own biases influence my decisions. Marcus studied him, looking for any sign of deflection, any sign that this was just corporate damage control. But for the first time since they met, Daniel actually looked uncomfortable in a way that seemed real. Jennifer clasped her hands together. I don't take situations like this lightly, she said. Mr. Carter, your actions not only disrespected a valued client but also put the reputation of this bank at risk. Moving forward, we need to decide what the consequences of this situation should be. Marcus felt the tension in the room rise. He could see the tightness in Daniel's shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly against the table. This was the moment. the moment that would determine how this all ended. But Marcus wasn't ready to let it end just yet. Not until he was sure the lesson had been learned. The room felt heavier now, like everyone was bracing for impact. Jennifer's words hung in the air, and Marcus could see the tension in Daniel's face. He wasn't sure if it was fear, regret, or just the discomfort of being held accountable. Either way, Marcus wasn't about to let this be swept under the rug with a simple apology. But before he could speak, Jennifer's assistant knocked on the glass door and stepped inside. She looked uneasy, her eyes flickering toward Jennifer before handing her a folder. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, keeping her voice low. "But I think you need to see this right away." Jennifer gave a small frown but took the folder, flipping it open. As she scanned the pages inside, her expression changed. First confusion, then something sharper. Marcus watched closely. Whatever was in that folder had just shifted the energy in the room. Jennifer closed the folder and set it on the table, folding her hands over it. She looked at Daniel, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter," she said, "is there anything else you'd like to tell us?" Daniel stiffened. I don't know what you mean." Jennifer let the silence stretch for a moment before she slid the folder across the table toward Marcus. He hesitated before opening it. What he saw made his stomach tighten. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. The documents inside listed multiple incidents, complaints filed against Daniel by other customers. All of them followed a similar pattern: unnecessary delays, excessive scrutiny, refusals to approve transactions. And nearly every single complaint came from a black or minority customer. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't just a bad call. This was a pattern. He looked up at Daniel, who had gone pale. "You've done this before," Marcus said. His voice quieter now but carrying more weight than before. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Jennifer exhaled, turning toward him. "Mr. Carter, this is not just an isolated mistake. These are repeated incidents over the course of 2 years. And they were never addressed because none of these complaints made it past the local branch." Marcus clenched his jaw. He could see it clearly now. It wasn't just about Daniel making a bad judgment call. It was about how many people had walked into that bank expecting fair treatment and had left feeling humiliated instead. People who had likely never gotten the chance to be heard. Jennifer shook her head, looking more frustrated by the second. "I need an explanation. Right now." Daniel swallowed hard, his fingers tapping against the table before he finally spoke. I never meant for it to be that way," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I was just trying to follow security protocols." "Security protocols," Marcus repeated, his patience wearing thin. Or was it just easier to assume the worst when it came to certain kinds of customers? Daniel looked down, his breathing uneven. He wasn't answering because he knew the truth was too ugly to say out loud. Jennifer turned to Marcus. "Mr. Bennett, I want you to know that this will not be ignored. This situation is much bigger than I initially realized." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He had come here expecting a conversation about what had happened to him, but now he realized this was about something far more systemic. Jennifer tapped her fingers against the table, thinking, "I need to escalate this to the corporate board immediately. There will be consequences." Marcus sat back, studying Daniel. He looked nothing like the confident, dismissive man from the day before. Now he just looked like someone who knew his time was up. But before anything else could be said, the conference room door swung open again. A man in a navy suit stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He walked straight to Jennifer and handed her a small envelope. "This was just delivered from the legal department," he said, before nodding at Marcus. "It concerns Mr. Bennett as well." Marcus exchanged a glance with Jennifer before she carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. As she read it, her eyebrows lifted in surprise. Then she turned to Marcus, her voice calm but firm. "It appears Mr. Bennett isn't just a partial owner of this bank." She glanced back at the paper before meeting his eyes again. As of this morning, due to an acquisition finalized by your holding company, you are now the majority shareholder. The room went silent. Marcus blinked. He sat up straighter, processing what she had just said. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like he had just been punched in the gut. His face drained of color as realization sank in. Marcus wasn't just a customer. He was now his boss. The weight of Jennifer's words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His hands, which had been resting flat on the table, curled into fists. His entire posture shifted from shock to something else, something closer to fear. Marcus, on the other hand, remained still. He let the realization sink in, let it stretch across the room. He hadn't expected this. He had known he had a stake in the bank, but majority control, that changed everything. Jennifer cleared her throat and turned back to Marcus. This acquisition was finalized earlier today. Given your new position, you now have direct authority over this branch and its leadership. She didn't have to say it out loud. The message was clear. The fate of Daniel Carter was now in Marcus's hands. Daniel finally found his voice, though it came out unsteady. Mr. Bennett, He stopped, exhaling sharply before trying again. Look, I know I made a mistake. But I've been with this bank for over a decade. I've built my career here. This doesn't have to end badly for either of us. Marcus studied him carefully. The confidence that Daniel had once carried, the smugness he had shown just yesterday, was gone. Now, he was a man desperately trying to hold on to whatever power he had left. I walked into this bank yesterday as a customer, Marcus said slowly. I left as a suspect. And now, I sit here as the man in charge. He leaned forward just slightly. Funny how quickly things change, isn't it? Daniel swallowed, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I never meant to disrespect you, he said. I was just following procedures. If I had known, Marcus cut him off. If you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently. That's the problem, isn't it? Daniel flinched. Jennifer watched silently, her expression unreadable. She knew better than to interfere now. Marcus let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. Tell me something, Daniel. When all those other complaints came in, when customer after customer walked out of here feeling the same way I did you ever stop to question yourself? Or did you assume they were all just overreacting? Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't have an answer. Marcus exhaled slowly, then turned to Jennifer. What would corporate's next steps be in a situation like this? Jennifer straightened. Given the evidence, Mr. Carter would likely be terminated. A formal review would take place, but with this many complaints, there's little room for leniency. Daniel's face darkened. He turned to Marcus. Look, Marcus held up a hand, stopping him. You're right about one thing, Daniel, Marcus said. This doesn't have to end badly. But that choice isn't mine. It's yours. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Marcus leaned back in his chair. You could fight this. You could drag this out, let it go to corporate, let your record become public. But I promise you, you won't win. His voice was calm, firm. Or you could own this. Admit that you were wrong, not just about me but about all of it. Step down on your own terms, take whatever dignity you have left, and walk out of here before this gets worse. Daniel looked between Marcus and Jennifer, his face unreadable. He was calculating, weighing his options, realizing that there weren't many left. His shoulders sagged slightly. Then finally he exhaled and nodded. I'll resign. Jennifer gave a small nod of acknowledgement. I'll have the paperwork drawn up immediately. Daniel stood up slowly, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. Just before stepping out, he glanced back at Marcus. I was wrong, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. About you. About a lot of things. Marcus didn't respond. He simply watched as Daniel walked out, the door closing softly behind him. For the first time in hours, the room felt lighter. Jennifer turned to Marcus. "That was unexpected." Marcus shook his head. "No, it wasn't. People like him never expect to be held accountable. They think the system will always protect them." Jennifer studied him for a moment before nodding. "So, what now?" Marcus exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "Now, I make sure this bank isn't just another place where people have to prove they belong before they're treated with respect." Jennifer gave him a small smile. "I have a feeling things are about to change around here." Marcus looked out the window, watching the city move below him. He had walked into that bank a customer and walked out an owner. But more importantly, he had walked out knowing that this wasn't just about him. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what he did. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like real power. The air in the conference room still carried the weight of everything that had just happened, but Marcus felt something shift within himself. He had come here thinking he was fighting one battle, only to realize it was a much bigger one. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had walked into this bank and been made to feel like they didn't belong. People who had been questioned, doubted, or dismissed simply because someone like Daniel Carter had made up his mind about them before they even spoke a word. Jennifer gathered her files, glancing at Marcus. "I'll make sure Daniel's resignation is processed immediately. There will be an internal review, of course, but given the circumstances, I don't anticipate any roadblocks." Marcus nodded. "Good. But this can't just be about one man stepping down. This has to be bigger than that." Jennifer studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "I agree. What are you thinking?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind already racing with possibilities. "We need to change how things work here. How hiring is done. How complaints are handled. How customers are treated, period." He exhaled slowly. "No one should have to feel the way I felt when I walked in here yesterday." Jennifer smiled slightly. "I had a feeling you'd say that." She slid another folder across the table. "This is a report on our diversity and inclusion efforts, or lack thereof. We haven't done nearly enough. If you're serious about making changes, this is where you start." Marcus opened the folder, skimming the pages. It was worse than he expected. Hiring practices that leaned heavily in one direction. A lack of minority representation in leadership. An internal complaint system that made it almost impossible for customer concerns to reach higher management. He set the folder down and looked up at Jennifer. "This stops now." She nodded. "Then let's get to work." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Marcus took an active role in reviewing policies, meeting with employees, and ensuring real changes were made. Some people resisted, of course. There were murmurs about how things had always been done, and whether all this was really necessary. But Marcus didn't back down. One by one, he made sure the right people were in the right places. He promoted employees who had been overlooked for too long, hired new managers who reflected the diversity of the customers they served, and ensured that every complaint, no matter how small, was taken seriously. Word spread quickly, not just within the bank but beyond it. Customers who had long felt uneasy walking through those doors started noticing the difference. Employees who had been afraid to speak up began to feel heard. One afternoon, as Marcus was reviewing some final paperwork in his office, a knock came at the door. He looked up to see an older black woman standing there. She looked familiar, but it took him a moment to place her. "Miss Thomas," he said, standing up. She had been in the bank that day, the woman who had been in line behind him, the one who had watched everything unfold. She stepped inside, a warm smile on her face. "I just wanted to stop by and say thank you," she said. "I heard about all the changes happening here, and I can feel it when I walk in. People are being treated differently. Better." Marcus gestured for her to sit. "That means a lot coming from you. But we're just getting started." She nodded. "I know. But change has to start somewhere. And it looks like it started with you." Marcus thought about that for a moment. He had never expected to be in this position, Never thought he would be the one making these kinds of decisions. But maybe that was the way it was supposed to happen. Maybe the only way to truly change something was to experience the problem firsthand. As Miss Thomas stood to leave, she paused at the door. "You know," she said with a small chuckle, "I bet that manager of yours never imagined he'd be working under the man he tried to kick out." Marcus smiled. "I doubt he did." She nodded approvingly before heading out, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. As he looked around his office, the office that had once belonged to Daniel Carter, he felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This wasn't just about owning a bank. It was about changing what ownership meant. And for the first time since walking through those doors, Marcus knew he belonged here.